From the Appalachian Mountains, welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history. Before we start, please leave a comment about where you are and when you heard this story. We want to know where and when these documented accounts come in. The autumn fog of 1898 hung over the low spots in Wise County, Virginia, like secrets that were too heavy to rise. In these far-off parts of the Appalachian Mountains, where the Ashworth estate was different from the small homes that were scattered throughout the valley. It was built on dark seams beneath ancient ridges, and its isolation led to strange customs. The three-story building, made of local limestone quarried from the mountainside and imported hardwood that had traveled by rail from the forests of North Carolina, had a view of the winding Clinch River below. Its Gothic revival style looked strange against the native oak and maple trees, as if someone had put a piece of European grandeur in the wild heart of Appalachia. After her husband, Silas Ashworth, died in the harsh winter of 1897, Cordelia Ashworth was the only person living on this estate. The county clerk's office above Brennan's general store was small, but the death certificate said that pneumonia was the cause of death. This was a common illness in those mountains, where dampness could get into bones and lungs just as easily as it could into bones. Silas was 53 years old, which meant he should have had a lot of useful years ahead of him. The Wise County Clerk's office has kept very good records, and they show that he left behind a large fortune that he made by making what seemed to be smart investments in coal mining operations in southwest Virginia and the eastern Kentucky counties next door. Not only was this inheritance, big neighbors thought it was worth almost $50,000, which was enough to buy half the county back then, but it was also very interesting. It was more like strange circumstances under which the wealth had been passed down, circumstances that would leave legal scholars scratching their heads and the local community asking questions for years to come. The inheritance was set up in a complicated way that involved several banks and a trust mechanism that seemed too complicated for a simple transfer of property. The Ashworth family moved to Wise County in the spring of 1885. Silas bought almost 3,000 acres of hilly land from the Virginia. The coal and iron company paid what local property records show was a surprisingly small amount. The previous owner wanted to sell quickly, but it seems that they were discouraged by how hard it was to get to the coal deposits under the rocky soil. Most speculators of the time wanted to make quick money by strip mining, which left scars on the land. Silas, on the other hand, seemed more interested in the land itself as a place to live permanently. He chose a place for his mansion that wasn't close to the valuable coal deposits, where mining operations would have suggested it should be, but at the highest point of his land, where the views went across several ridges and valleys. Deposits, which would have made sense for mining operations, but at the highest point of his holdings, where the views stretched across several ridges and valleys. On clear days, you could see almost 30 miles in any direction from this spot. It included parts of 3 counties and gave you a great view of all the mountain roads that went through the area. Local contractors, like master carpenter Zebulon Harwick and stonemason Cornelius, worked on building the house. Tate, who kept detailed business records that lasted well into the 20th century, remembered Silas's strange requests for the building. The outside walls were going to be twice as thick as what most people thought was necessary. To do this, they used a double-layered technique that needed special masonry tools to be brought in from Richmond. Silas had apparently figured out the best compass directions for the windows to face by doing careful surveying work himself during the phases of planning. The most important thing was that the basement would go much deeper into the mountain than a normal foundation would need to. Silas had insisted on digging chambers that went 20 feet below ground level, cutting directly into the native bedrock and adding stonework that one craftsman said was better for a mine shaft than a house foundation. Silas had been in charge of the digging work and had told the workers to follow exact measurements and specifications that he gave in detailed architectural drawings that he made himself. The marriage between Silas and Cordelia took place in 1889. It was a good match because both of them came from backgrounds that seemed to fit well with the grandeur of their mountain estate. County records show that Cordelia Margrave came from Richmond to be the governess for Judge Lysander Morrison's family. Judge Morrison is one of the most well-known lawyers in the area. She had come to Wise County. She had a degree from the Richmond Female Institute and could speak French and German, which made her stand out from most women in the rural mountain community. People who knew Cordelia while she worked for the Morrison family said she was very smart and had a lot of education. She was especially interested in botany and natural history, which is why she spent a lot of time exploring the mountain forests and making lists of the native plants. She kept a lot of journals that recorded her plant observations, with pressed specimens and detailed drawings that showed both her scientific training and her artistic talent. People in the valley sometimes saw Silas and Cordelia together on her solo botanical trips, but most of their courtship took place out of the public eye. It seemed like Silas would show up at strange places where she was doing her research, and the two would spend time together. Hours talking while looking at plant samples and talking about what people thought were things that both scientists would be interested in. Pastor Cornelius Wade of the Valley's Presbyterian congregation officiated their wedding, which was a small event attended mostly by members of the Morrison family and a few important people from the county. It was strange that no one from Silas's family was there, which led to some speculation because of his apparent wealth and social status. When asked about his past, Silas only gave vague answers about business interests in far-off cities and family ties that had been broken by disagreements that he didn't want to talk about. From the outside, the marriage looked good. Both the husband and wife took part in the few social activities that were available in the mountain community. They went to church a lot, gave a lot of money to charities, and sometimes hosted dinner parties for the county's professional class. But servants who worked at the estate, like longtime housekeeper Patience Crowley and groundskeeper Morai Finch, sometimes talked to other domestic workers about how the couple lived in separate parts of the house and how Mrs. Ashworth often went for long walks alone on the mountain trails, sometimes disappearing for days without saying why. These long absences happened more often in the last few years of Silas's life, especially after 1895 when his health started to get worse. Indications of deterioration that his doctor, Dr. Nathaniel Grayson, struggled to identify. The symptoms were progressive weight loss, periods of confusion, and what Dr. Grayson wrote in his medical notes as obsessive behaviors related to collecting and preserving natural specimens. After Silas died in January 1897, Cordelia got not only the estate and mining interests, but also what looked like a lot of cash in banks as far away as New York, Charleston, and Philadelphia. The lawyers at the Richmond firm of Cavendish, Worthington, and Associates wrote up the inheritance paperwork. It included detailed lists of securities, real estate holdings, and cash accounts that showed a level of wealth that was much higher than what people in the area had thought. But the inheritance came with a condition that the lawyers who handled the estate transfer found strange. Cordelia had to stay on the property for at least 5 years after her husband died, with any attempt to sell or give away the land causing the whole estate to go back to a trust in Philadelphia that is not named. The lawyers who wrote these papers said they had never seen such strict inheritance rules before, especially ones that seemed more meant to keep the beneficiary from getting the money than to protect the assets. In the months after Silas's funeral, he became more and more isolated, which worried the few neighbors who could visit him easily. The distance from the mountain estate. The Jennings family lived 2 miles down the mountain road on what was then called the Clinch River Pike. They had been friends with the Ashworths before, with Martha Jennings and Cordelia visiting each other and sharing their love of plants, which had led to a real friendship. Martha Jennings later gave county officials a lot of information about the worrying changes she saw in Cordelia's behavior in the spring and summer of 1898. Cordelia had been friendly to visitors and an active member of the small Presbyterian church that served the small mountain community. She didn't leave her property very often anymore, and she had let go of most of the household staff who had worked for the family since they moved to the county. The firings were done quickly, with workers getting only a short notice and little explanation for why they were being let go. A number of former workers, Martha Jennings, heard from cook Hannah Prescott and stable hand Jeremiah Cummings that Cordelia had been getting more and more upset during the last few weeks of their service. They said that she had been spending long hours in parts of the house that were off-limits to the domestic staff and had been looking through Silas's personal papers. The only servant Cordelia still had was Patience Coley, a woman in her 60s who had worked for the Ashworths since they moved to the county. Patience lived in a small cabin on the estate grounds, about 200 yards from the main house and near the edge of the apple orchard. She was in charge of both cleaning and cooking, but former employees said that her duties seemed to have grown to include helping Cordelia with what she called completing Silas's work. Patience had been vague when asked about the specifics of this work, only telling neighbors that Mrs. Ashworth spent more and more time doing it. She spent hours in the basement of the house, and when she came out, her clothes looked like they had clay stains on them and her fingernails were dirty. Silas had always kept the basement to himself. He told the household staff to stay away from the lower level of the house unless he was there to watch them. As the summer of 1898 went on, it became harder for Martha Jennings to stay in touch with the Cordelia. People who used to be happy to see visitors now didn't want them to come. Cordelia says she can't come because she's sick, tired, or has too much work to do. When Martha was able to talk to her old friend for a short time, she noticed big changes in how Cordelia looked and acted. The woman who used to be very neat now looked like she hadn't changed clothes in days and wasn't taking care of her personal hygiene, which was very different from how she used to be. Changes in the way Cordelia talked were more worrying. She had previously been very articulate and interested in a lot of different things that made her a fun and informative person to be around. Now, most of what she talked about was technical stuff about preservation methods and what she called scientific research that needed to be done in complete privacy to be successful. When Martha tried to change the subject to more normal things, Cordelia would get angry and say that people in the community didn't understand. The work she was still doing was very important. The construction workers who built the house more than 10 years ago were curious about the basement itself. The original architectural plans, which are kept in the county records and were drawn by Silas in his own handwriting, showed a standard foundation and root cellar that are common in large mountain homes. But stonemasons who worked on the project said that Silas had personally overseen the digging of extra rooms under the main building, changes that were not mentioned in any official documents. These rooms were cut directly into the mountain rock using methods that are more often used in mining than in building homes. The walls were made of fired brick and had a waterproof coating that needed to be imported from Baltimore because it was so special. There were narrow passages that connected the chambers and went in several directions from the main basement, which made a huge underground complex that was much bigger than the foundation work that could be seen from outside the building would have led you to believe. Cornelius Tate, the master stonemason who oversaw most of the work on the foundation, kept detailed records of the project, including his thoughts on how strange the excavation was. Silas had insisted on certain sizes for each room and had required that the connecting passages be built according to his notes found among family papers in 1924, built with small slopes that would help water flow toward a central collection point. The craftsmen working on the project were most confused by Silas's insistence on putting in a complicated ventilation system that pulled air from the basement rooms through hidden ducts that came out at different points around the outside of the house. The system was made to work passively, using the natural flow of air to keep the temperature and humidity levels in the underground stable. Places. This level of environmental control was unheard of in residential construction at the time, which made it seem like the basement was meant for activities that needed very specific weather conditions. In the summer of 1898, a number of strange things happened that would later be looked into as part of the official investigation into Cordelia's disappearance. The first was Dr. Nathaniel Grayson, the doctor who had cared for Silas during his last illness and who had continued to care for prominent families in the county. Helped important families all over the county. Dr. Grayson had been coming by every so often to check on Cordelia's health, which was normal for widows of rich families, especially those who lived alone. Dr. Grayson noticed that Cordelia had lost a lot of weight since their last meeting when he saw her in July. She also showed signs of chronic sleep deprivation, such as tremors in her hands and trouble concentrating when they were talking. Her references, too, were more worrisome. Letters. She said that she found letters in Silas's papers that she thought showed evidence of conspiracy and foul play in her husband's death. Researchers looking into medical practices in 19th century Appalachia found Dr. Grayson's personal journal among his estate papers decades later. It has a full account of this conversation. Cordelia had found a bunch of letters hidden in a fake bottom of Silas's desk, according to his notes. Correspondence that looked like it was written in code or maybe a language from another country. Along with the letters were detailed drawings that looked like anatomical diagrams. Cordelia's descriptions didn't make it clear what these pictures were of, but she was sure that they were proof of a plot involving Silas's business partners in the coal mining industry and that he had been poisoned on purpose by people who wanted to take over, of his rights to minerals. Dr. Grayson said that her grief and loneliness might be clouding her judgment. Cordelia got angry and told him to check Silas's grave for signs of tampering or disturbance. The doctor was very worried about this request because it showed that Cordelia's mental state had gotten much worse, and because it made him worry about her ability to live safely alone. He tried to get her to think about moving to town where she could get better medical care and social support. But Cordelia got more and more angry at this suggestion. She said that she couldn't stop working on the estate because it was too important, and that leaving the property would keep her from finding out what really happened to her husband. Dr. Grayson's journal entry ends with his note that Cordelia's behavior indicated the early stages of what doctors at the time called melancholia with paranoid manifestations. Manifestations, a condition that frequently impacted individuals who had endured traumatic loss while in social isolation. He says he plans to keep a closer eye on her health and call county officials if her mental state gets worse. The doctor's next scheduled visit in August didn't happen as planned. Dr. Grayson drove his medical cart along the mountain road that led to the estate from the southeast. He discovered the main gates were locked and chained, and there was a handwritten sign saying that Mrs. Ashworth was not seeing visitors because she was very sick and needed to be alone. Dr. Grayson tried to get into the property in other ways because he was worried about Cordelia's health, especially since she seemed to be having mental problems during their last meeting. He knew the mountain trails around the estate well because he was interested in plants. He knew that a hiking path led to the house from the north, along a ridgeline that made it possible to get there without using the main road. Dr. Grayson would never forget what he saw during this unauthorized visit. It would stay with him for the rest of his life and be the basis for worries that eventually led to official action. He spent several hours watching the estate from hidden spots in the surrounding forest and writing about what he saw in increasingly detailed journal entries. These activities showed that Cordelia's behavior had gotten much worse, more than he had thought before. The doctor saw lights moving through the basement windows of the house during the day, along with sounds he described as rhythmic banging, like someone breaking rock with heavy tools. The noise went on for hours at a time, with short breaks of silence in between. When the noise started again, it sounded like organized and purposeful work instead of random destruction. What worried him more were what he saw Cordelia doing in the formal gardens of the estate, on more than one. He saw her move between the basement and what looked like newly dug-up areas in places that used to be flower beds. She mostly worked before dawn, using lantern light to see what she was doing. It looked like she was burying things in carefully measured spots that she marked with small wooden stakes. Dr. Grayson learned about anatomy while studying medicine at the University of Virginia, which helped him realize that the things Cordelia was burying looked like they were made of living things, like tissue samples or other biological materials. The way she worked and the way she kept track of things suggested that she was organized, which was not consistent with random or psychotic behavior. Dr. Grayson couldn't get to the property directly through normal means, so he decided to call Pastor Cornelius Wade of the Valley's Presbyterian Church in the hopes that religious authority might succeed where doctors had failed. Pastor Wade had known Silas and Cordelia since they moved to the county. He married them in 1889 and kept in touch with most of the important families in the area. The pastor had a lot of education and real-world experience. He had worked in mountain communities for more than 20 years before taking the job in Wise County. He had seen many different kinds of mental distress in his parishioners, especially the disorders that come from being alone that were common in remote rural areas. He was usually able to help families who were having mental health problems by giving them both spiritual comfort and practical help. Dr. Grayson talked about what he saw and how worried he was about Cordelia's health. Pastor Wade agreed that intervention was necessary for both pastoral and community reasons. He had noticed that Cordelia hadn't been going to church services in the months before and had heard from other parishioners that she was becoming more and more reclusive. He thought these changes were normal reactions to grief and didn't realize how bad her mental health had gotten. The two men drove up to the Ashworth estate in Dr. Grayson's medical cart on a foggy morning in early September 1898. They were ready to use both medical and religious authority to get access to the house if Cordelia tried to stop them from coming. The estate looked very different from what they were used to seeing. Changes that made it clear right away that there were big problems with how it was being taken care of and managed. The formal gardens that Cordelia had worked hard to keep up during her marriage were now overgrown with weeds and volunteer plants, which had basically returned large areas to their natural state. A carriage house and other outbuildings, and the shed for tools looked like it had been taken apart on purpose, as if someone had been systematically taking parts of it apart to use somewhere else on the property. The many holes dug into the ground around the main house were the most interesting thing. These looked like they were made on purpose, not by natural erosion or animals. The excavations were about 3 feet square and 1 to 4 feet deep, which suggests that they were done in a planned way over and for a long time. A lot of the holes had been filled in, but the disturbed earth was still easy to see and made a patchwork pattern on what had once been well-kept lawns. Patience Crowley met the visitors at the servants' entrance on the north side of the house. Her appearance shocked both men, who had known her as a strong and capable woman during her years of service with the family. It looked like she had lost a lot of weight. Her clothes were loose on her body, and she showed nervous behavior that included looking back at the inside of the house a lot, as if they were expecting to be seen or heard. When Pastor Wade told the patients why they were there and asked to see Cordelia, they tried to stop them at first by saying that her employer had been sick for a few weeks and had told them not to let anyone else in. But Pastor Wade strongly insisted on his right as a pastor to check on a member of his congregation, especially one who had missed a number of church services without giving a reason. Patience reluctantly agreed to take the visitors into the house, leading them through the kitchen and servants' quarters to the main hall. She chose a path that avoided the main entrance and reception rooms, which may have been to keep the people there from seeing all the changes that had happened in the building. The inside of the mansion had changed in a way that was even more disturbing than the outside falling apart. Furniture that had. The furniture that had been set up in the usual way in the parlor and sitting room had been moved away from the walls, leaving big open spaces in the middle of each room. A lot of the expensive rugs, tapestries, and decorative items that had been in the house during Silas's life had been taken out, making the rooms look bare and institutional. The most disturbing thing was the evidence of a lot of digging that had been done inside the house itself. Some parts of the hardwood floor had been carefully taken off, showing the subflooring underneath. In some cases, holes had been dug through the subflooring to get to the ground below the foundation. It looked like the excavation was done in a planned way, with each hole being measured exactly and the materials that were taken out being carefully sorted and stored in containers nearby. Dr. Grayson noted that the excavation work showed signs of both planning and a lot of hard work. The holes were all the same size and spaced out, which means they were made on purpose, following a set plan instead of just digging randomly. There were tools for the work in a few rooms, including specialized tools that looked like they were made for digging up things from the past or the earth, not for regular building or fixing things. When the visitors asked where Cordelia was, the patients pointed to a staircase that led to the basement and said that her boss spent most of her time taking care of the collection. Pastor Wade and Dr. Grayson both understood what this meant, but both saw that the patient's hands were shaking as she spoke, and she seemed to be holding back tears that showed she was really upset about what was going on. Dr. Grayson, who had medical training and had worked with patients who were mentally ill in different ways, asked the patients directly if they felt safe staying on the property. This question made her look around frantically as if she were making sure that no one could hear their conversation before she whispered that she couldn't go until the job was done. This answer made people worry right away about the patient's own mental health and the possibility that Cordelia's mental health was getting worse and affecting other people in the house. The old woman who cleaned the house looked like she was under a lot of stress, but neither visitor could tell right away if this was because of fear, loyalty, or her own mental health issues. Pastor Wade called out for Cordelia from the top of the basement stairs, saying who he was and Dr. Grayson, and explaining why they were there. He spoke in his most authoritative pastoral voice to make it clear that he expected to be welcomed, and that their concern for her well-being justified their presence on the property. After a few minutes, they heard footsteps coming up from below, along with what Dr. Grayson later called a dragging sound that sounded like metal. Oh, like someone was moving heavy machinery over a stone floor. When Cordelia came out of the basement, both men were horrified by how she looked. Look, she had lost a lot of weight since they last saw each other, going from a woman with normal proportions to one who looked almost like a skeleton. Her clothes were dirty with clay, rust, and what looked like different chemicals. It looked like she had been wearing the same clothes for days or weeks without changing or cleaning them. Her hands were the most disturbing sign of what she had been doing lately. They were badly hurt from doing manual labor and had a lot of cuts, and her fingernails were broken and had things that looked like dirt, clay, and maybe even organic material stuck in them. She also had abrasions that were healing at different stages. The injuries suggested that the work was physically demanding and possibly dangerous, and that it was done without the right safety gear or medical care. Cordelia's mental state during the encounter was more worrying than her physical state. She greeted both men warmly, as if their visit was completely normal and welcome. She didn't seem to know that her. The state of the house or the way it looks might worry people. She talked about her project with a lot of energy and invited them to look at it. This showed that she was not following social norms, which could be a sign of serious mental health problems. Pastor Wade later gave a detailed account of the conversation, saying that Cordelius talked a lot about keeping Silas's legacy alive and making sure the collection was complete before winter. She used words that were specific to preservation and classification that showed she knew a little bit about scientific methods, but her explanations were often unclear and included references to ideas that neither visitor could understand or check. When asked to explain more about her collection and the work that was taking up her time, Cordelia became evasive. However, she eventually agreed to show both men the basement laboratory where she said she was continuing research that Silas had started years before. She kept saying that their visit was. She needed witnesses to prove how important the work was and to make sure it would keep going, even if something happened that stopped her from finishing it herself. The stairs down to the basement led to rooms that had been changed a lot since the house was first built. The mountain rock had been carved into several rooms beyond the original foundation. These rooms were connected by narrow passages that went in different directions from the main chamber. The digging work showed. There was a lot of skill and work put into the walls, which were carefully shaped and finished to make usable lab spaces. The walls of these rooms had wooden shelves on them that looked like they had been taken from the old buildings that had been torn down on the estate grounds. There were hundreds of glass containers of different sizes on these shelves, from small specimen jars to large preservation vessels that could hold things that were several feet long. What was in each container looked like organic samples that had been kept in clear liquid. It was hard to tell what these specimens were because the oil lamps in the chambers didn't give off much light. Cordelia told her guests that Silas had been a collector of natural curiosities and that she was continuing his work by cataloging and preserving the things he had collected on his long trips through the Appalachian region. She was especially proud of how she carefully sorted things, showing them handwritten ledgers where each specimen was numbered, dated, and described in detail, including information about where it came from, how it was collected, and how it was preserved. The ledgers themselves were impressive documents that showed both scientific training and careful record-keeping. There were detailed drawings of the specimens, notes about their physical features, and ideas about what they meant in a scientific or medical way in each entry. The early entries looked like Silas's handwriting, but the more recent ones were clearly in Cordelia's handwriting. This shows that she had been actively adding to and expanding the collection for months after her husband's death. Dr. Grayson looked at some of the samples more closely, using his medical knowledge to figure out what they were and how they were doing. He was upset to find out that a lot of the preserved things looked like they came from people, like tissues, organs, and bones. Samples that had traits that made it seem like they came from more than one person. When he diplomatically asked Cordelia where these specimens came from, she gave answers that were both very detailed and very disturbing. Cordelia said that Silas had made friends with doctors and morticians in the area who gave him samples from people who had died from strange diseases or who had unusual physical traits. She promised both visitors that all of the specimens had been gotten through legal agreements with families who were happy that their dead relatives were helping to improve medical education and scientific knowledge. But Dr. Grayson's professional knowledge helped him see that some parts of the collection didn't match up with what Cordelia said. A lot of the preserved tissues looked very fresh and had features that made it seem like they had been taken recently instead of when Silas was alive. The methods used to preserve the body were more advanced than what most small-town doctors or undertakers would have had access to. They used chemicals and procedures that required special knowledge and tools. The most worrying thing was that the collection seemed to be done in a planned way. Instead of being random chances to get interesting specimens, the materials looked like they had been collected on purpose, with a focus on certain kinds of organs and tissues. The group said that someone had been actively looking for certain specimens instead of just taking whatever was available through normal death patterns in the area. When Dr. Grayson politely brought up his worries about how fresh some of the specimens were, and asked if they could have been gotten legally as Cordelia had said, her mood changed a lot. The woman who had welcomed them with open arms and enthusiasm became angry and defensive, saying that Dr. Grayson wasn't qualified to figure out the age or condition of specimens that had been properly preserved. She wanted to know why he was asking those questions, and she accused him of trying to get in the way of important scientific work that would help everyone in the long run. Her answer included technical information about preservation chemistry and anatomical classification that showed she knew a lot, but it also showed an obsessive intensity that was very disturbing to both of us. Guests. As Cordelia got more and more upset, she started to say things about the collection that showed how bad her mental health had gotten. She said that Silas kept giving her advice about the work by leaving notes in their bedroom every night. Communication that helped her figure out which specimens she still needed to finish the collection. She was sure she would get instructions about the last part of the work before the arrival of winter weather that would make some parts of the project harder. Pastor Wade tried to calm things down by changing the subject from the scientific parts of the collection to Cordelia's spiritual health. He offered to pray with her and told her that she might feel better if she went back to church, where other Christians could help her and be with her while she was grieving and getting used to things. But Cordelia turned down these offers more and more. Hostility, saying that religious issues had nothing to do with her current job, and that getting involved in the community would only get in the way of her duties. As the situation in the basement lab got worse, both visitors grew more worried about their own safety and Cordelia's. Her behavior had gone from strange to truly dangerous, and because the estate was so far away from other people, help would not be easy to find if things got even worse. Pastor Wade decided to end their visit while keeping diplomatic ties, hoping to come back later with more help if they needed to intervene. But before they left the basement, Cordelia said a number of things that both men found very upsetting and that would change how they dealt with the situation later. She said that her work was broken up into different phases, and that the current specimen collection was just the first step in a bigger project that would end with what she called the joining process. When Pastor Wade asked Cordelia to explain this process, she said that her main goal was to have some kind of communion with Silas that would let them keep working together in science even after they died. She thought that by carefully studying and preserving human consciousness as it was stored in different organs and tissues, she could come up with ways to keep in touch with dead people, and eventually she would find a way to live forever that would let her research go on forever. These new facts made both visitors sure that Cordelia was having a very bad mental breakdown that had gotten much worse than either of them had thought at first. The combination of being alone, grieving, and what looked like obsessive behavior had put her in a mental state that didn't seem to have much to do with the truth. It was even more concerning that her delusions were leading her to do more and more dangerous things that could put her own life and the lives of others in the community at risk. After they left the estate, Dr. Grayson and Pastor Wade met alone at the pastor's house to talk about what they had seen and come up with a plan for how to deal with it. Both men agreed that Cordelia needed professional help right away, but they also knew that the legal and practical problems were big. Cordelia was a widow with a lot of money and no known relatives in the area. She had the legal right to manage her property and personal affairs as she saw fit. Her strange behavior, while very concerning, did not mean she had to be committed to a mental health facility against her will. Dr. Grayson was especially worried about the samples they had seen in the basement lab. Because of his medical training, he was able to see that. Many of the preserved materials were of human origin and seemed to be much newer than what Cordelia said they were. The systematic way the specimens were collected and the advanced methods used to keep them safe raised big questions about how they were gotten and whether Cordelia's actions were criminal in addition to being mentally ill. Pastor Wade had these worries too, but he was also worried about how patients were getting worse. Crowley, whose obvious distress made it clear that other people might be in danger if Cordelia's health continued to get worse. The housekeeper's scared behavior and her claim that she couldn't leave until the work was done suggested that she might be being forced to stay, or that she had become psychologically dependent on Cordelia in ways that made it hard for her to find safety. After a lot of talking, both men agreed that county officials with the power to do so needed to step in, and the means to do a full investigation. Dr. Grayson said he would call Sheriff Josiah Brennan and give him a full medical report on Cordelia's condition. Pastor Wade said he would help with the request for an investigation from a pastoral point of view and help organize community resources if protection was needed. Sheriff Brennan had been in charge of Wise County for almost 10 years and had dealt with a wide range of criminal and civil issues. But the case that Dr. Grayson and Pastor Wade brought to him was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Because Cordelia was rich and well-known, her mental illness, possible criminal behavior, and the problems that came with her wealth and social status all needed to be carefully thought out in terms of both the law and how the community would react. At first, the sheriff didn't want to get involved because it looked like it was mostly a family matter between one of the county's richest and most important residents. But Dr. Grayson's description of the basement lab and the strange specimens made him think that a formal investigation was needed, especially since there was a chance that criminal activity was involved in getting human tissues for the collection. Sheriff Brennan chose to do a preliminary investigation by going to the estate with 2 deputies to see what was going on and decide if more help was needed. He planned to make the visit seem like a normal welfare check, because people in the community were worried about Cordelia's health and safety, and they didn't want to make any direct accusations that could lead to more problems or legal issues. Sheriff Brennan arrived at the Ashworth estate on October 15, 1898. He was with deputies Micah Tulick and Samuel Hartwell, as well as County Clerk J.B.Z. Morrison, who was in charge of writing down any official findings. The group walked up to the property through the main entrance, thinking they would have a simple interview with Cordelia, and a quick look around the place to see if Dr. Grayson and Pastor Wade's worries were true or not. What they found right away made it clear that the situation was worse than anyone had thought. The estate's main gates were open, which was strange because Cordelia had been very private lately. However, the property looked like it was completely empty. Even though it was cool outside in the fall, there was no smoke coming from the house chimneys. Normal activity around the buildings or grounds at home. When the officials called out and got no answer, the house itself looked empty. All of the outside doors were open, but the inside looked like it had been left in a hurry, instead of being lived in. There were personal items all over the rooms, and some areas looked like they had been disturbed recently, as if someone had been going through furniture and storage areas. Most importantly, Crowley was nowhere to be found in the patients. Property. Her cabin looked like she had left quickly because her things were all over the place and some important things were missing, which made it seem like she had left without packing properly. There was no note or message saying why she wasn't there, and none of the families next door knew where she was or what she was up to. The basement lab was still mostly in good shape, but a lot of the specimen containers had been taken away or broken. The floors of the carved chambers were covered in broken glass, and the preserving. The fluid had made a smell that was so strong that the officers who were looking into it could hardly stand it. Most of the scientific equipment and detailed records were also taken away. However, pages found in the debris showed that the documentation was very thorough and well organized. Sheriff Brennan ordered a full search of the estate grounds, which uncovered several burial sites in the gardens and wooded areas. But digging up these places was very frustrating. Not clear. The digging pattern suggested that things were buried in a planned way over a long time, but most of the graves only had animal remains or organic matter that had rotted beyond recognition. The investigation became more difficult when Cordelia's personal items were found in her bedroom, which meant that she had left the house without taking important things. Her clothes stayed in the closets. There was still a lot of cash and jewelry in the cases. Were found in a safe in the bedroom that had been left open. This evidence backed up the idea that she left suddenly and without planning, but it didn't give any clues about where she was going or why she left. It was most confusing that there was no explanation for what had happened to the large collection of specimens that Dr. Grayson and Pastor Wade had seen just a few weeks before. The basement rooms were mostly empty, with only broken glass and chemical smells left over to show that they were once used. Contents before. It was so well done that there was almost no sign left of what had been stored in the hundreds of containers. The search for Cordelia Ashworth continued through the winter of 1898 and 1899. It involved law enforcement officers from many areas and volunteer search parties organized by local communities. Even though a lot of work was done over hundreds of square miles of mountains, no sign of her was ever found. The official investigation finally came to the conclusion that she probably had a full mental breakdown and either killed herself in the middle of nowhere or left the area completely under a false name. The legal issues surrounding the estate were just as complicated as the search for its missing owner. Lawyers trying to carry out the inheritance terms found that the Philadelphia trust mentioned in Silas's will could not be found after searching through a lot of legal and financial records. Most of the banks that are said to hold Ashworth's assets had no accounts in Silas's name, and some of the banks listed in the estate documents seem to have never existed. This news suggested that the Ashworth family's apparent wealth was mostly fake, built on false documents that made it look like they were doing well without having any real assets. The coal mining investments and real estate holdings that were said to be the basis of the inheritance either didn't exist or were way too valuable in the estate planning papers. The Ashworth property was eventually declared abandoned and put under the control of the county until the inheritance disputes were settled. The basement lab was permanently sealed with concrete to keep people from getting in without permission, and the main house was boarded up to keep it safe from weather and vandalism. But because of the legal problems, the property was still basically worthless, and no one wanted to buy it, even though the land is large and the buildings are well made. In the years after Cordelia went missing, most people in the area stayed away from the estate. The mountain road that led to the property gradually became overgrown and could only be used by people walking. People in the community started to talk about the widow's lab, but the stories were often wrong because they were told over and over again and added supernatural elements that had nothing to do with the real facts of the case. The secret of, if researchers hadn't found out more than 60 years later about completely different parts of Appalachian history, Cordelia Ashworth's fate might have just been another sad story about a family living alone in the mountains. Eventually, these discoveries would show that the case was much more complicated and disturbing than the first investigation had thought. Dr. Ambrose Farweather, a historian who studies 19th-century Appalachian settlement, became interested in the Ashworth case in 1962 while looking into land ownership records for a big study of coal mining development in southwest Virginia. Patterns became interested in the Ashworth case while looking through land ownership records for a big study of how coal mining has changed in southwest Virginia. Dr. Fairweather was especially interested in the strange inheritance rules and the fact that the estate's supposed wealth circumstances had completely disappeared, which didn't fit with how property is usually transferred in the area. Dr. Fairweather's initial research entailed a systematic examination of county records, bank records, and newspaper articles from that time. An effort that slowly showed big problems with the official story about the Ashworth family's background and money situation. His results showed that almost everything that was known about Silas Ashworth's business dealings and how he got his money had been deliberately lied about through a complex scheme that had fooled local officials and community members for over 10 years. Records from the bank at the time showed that. Silas did own some mining rights and real estate, but the cash assets that were supposed to make up most of the inheritance were completely made up. Most of the banks and other financial institutions mentioned in the estate documents either didn't have any records of Ashworth accounts or never existed at all. The impressive paperwork that showed the family was rich looked like it had been made through forgery and fraud on a large scale, which suggested a lot of skill and planning. This finding made Dr. Farweather question other parts of the accepted story about the Ashworth family. If their wealth was made up, where did they really get their money? How had they kept up their expensive way of life and paid for the building and running of the mountain estate? What was the real point of Silas's fancy basement lab and Cordelia's obsessive work on it? The historian's research slowly found proof that, questioned almost every part of the usual story about the case. Dr. Grayson had been writing down worrying symptoms in Silas's hospital records for months before he died. Observations that were completely at odds with the pneumonia diagnosis on the official death certificate. The doctor's private notes talked about how the patient's neurological condition was getting worse, and how he was having paranoid delusions about outside forces changing his body and awareness. Dr. Grayson was even more worried about Silas's obsession with collecting and studying human tissues in order to keep proof of these supposed changes. The medical records indicated that Silas believed his body was undergoing a transformation that could be recorded and possibly reversed through scientific examination of preserved specimens from himself and other affected individuals. Dr. Fairweather's study also showed that the Ashworth estate had been the site of strange medical activity all through the 1890s, with many people claiming to be doctors or medical researchers coming and going, but they didn't seem to be connected to any local healthcare facilities. A lot of the time, these visitors brought special tools and materials with them and stayed for days or weeks before leaving with packages that local people thought were full of medical supplies or scientific specimens. The historian's search for missing. Reports from that time showed a pattern that made Cordelia's specimen collection even more disturbing. At least 12 people went missing in Wise County between 1890 and 1898. Local authorities said this was because of the dangers of traveling in the mountains or the fact that the mining workforce was only there for a short time. But Dr. Farweather's study of these disappearances showed that they all had something in common that made him think there was a more sinister reason for them. Most of the people who went missing were not well known in the area, were traveling alone, and had been seen near the Ashworth estate shortly before they went missing. Several of them had been sick or had physical problems that would have made them interesting for medical research. Dr. Farweather's investigation made the biggest progress when he found sealed court records from the 1899 probate proceedings that no other researchers had been able to see before. These papers showed that the official investigation into Cordelia's disappearance had found evidence that was much more disturbing than what the public had been told at the time. The sealed records said that more rooms had been found in the basement complex that had not been found during the first search. Behind fake walls, these rooms were carefully hidden. Inside, there was what looked like a fully equipped surgical facility with operating tables, anesthesia equipment, and a large collection of medical supplies. Instruments that were much better than what real doctors would have had access to in the remote mountain area. It was even worse to find detailed written records of systematic medical experiments on living people that had been going on for years. These records, which were written in both Silas's and Cordelia's handwriting, explained how to study how consciousness stays alive in human tissues and organs, experiments that involved taking things out in a systematic way, and preservation of body parts from people who were apparently kept alive for most of the process. The papers showed that Silas and Cordelia had come up with a complicated theoretical framework based on the idea that human consciousness could be kept alive in preserved tissues if the process was done while the person was still alive. Their goal was to find a way to stay alive and talk to each other after their physical bodies died, carefully keeping important organs and nervous tissues safe. The records showed that they had been doing these experiments on travelers and transients for years. They used the remote location of the mountainous state to avoid being caught while they improved their preservation methods and looked at the results. The organized nature of the operation and the high-tech tools used showed that this was not just a case of isolated craziness, but an organized research program with specific goals. Scientific goals. Dr. Farweather's examination of the sealed records led him to determine that the Ashwood case exemplified one of the most methodical and protracted instances of human experimentation in American history. Done decades before these kinds of things were linked to institutional medical research programs. The size of the operation made it clear that Silas and Cordelia had been responsible for a lot of deaths over a long period of time, all of which were made to look like natural disappearances in an area where people didn't think anything was wrong with these things happening all the time. The historian had to make a tough moral choice about what to do with his findings. The evidence he had found was mostly based on documents that had been sealed for legal reasons and sources that other scholars might not trust. If the evidence didn't support his conclusions, publishing his research would probably hurt the families of the missing people and hurt his professional reputation. After a lot of thought, Dr. Farweather decided to write up his findings in a short academic paper that mostly talked about the social and economic factors that made the Appalachian region open to predatory behavior in the late 1800s. This method let him share his research without making specific claims that couldn't be backed up by the evidence he had. But even this careful approach had effects that were not expected and showed how powerful it still is. Of the case to have an impact on those who looked into it too much. In 1964, Dr. Farweather got a letter from Edgar Mullins, a retired railroad supervisor. Mullins's grandfather had been a traveling surveyor in the Appalachian region in the 1890s. Mullins had read Dr. Roba Farweather's academic paper and saw connections between it and his own family's historical records. The family's journals from his grandfather, which they kept for more than 7 decades, had many references to the Ashwood estate and talked about meeting both Silas and Cordelia, which gave important extra information about what they were doing. Estate and talked about meeting both Silas and Cordelia, which gave important extra information about the range of their activities. The surveyor's detailed report said that the Ashworths were well known in the area for collecting medical specimens. They had built up a large network of contacts who told them about people with strange diseases or physical problems. This network included doctors, undertakers, and people who traveled. Merchants who were paid to find possible subjects and help them get to the mountain estate. The journals also showed that Silas had a number of helpers who traveled through the mountains looking for and collecting specimens for his collection. These people often pretended to be doctors offering free treatment for strange conditions. They gained the trust of possible subjects before arranging for them to be taken to the estate, where the real purposes of the treatment became clear. Most importantly, the surveyor's records had a lot of information about a meeting with Cordelia in the summer of 1898, just a few months before she went missing. This story says that Cordelia went up to the surveyor and offered to buy his maps and geographic documents. She said she needed detailed information about remote mountain areas for a research trip she was planning. She talked a lot about her belief that the Appalachian Mountains had unique geological features that could help keep people's minds alive after they died. Mountains had special geological features that could help keep human consciousness alive after death. She said that her work was an attempt to record and use these properties through systematic experimentation that would eventually change medical science and how people understand death. The surveyor turned down her offers and wrote in his journal that Cordelia's behavior had been so disturbing that he had decided to stay away from the Ashworth estate on future trips through the area. His last entries about the family, written in October 1898, said that other travelers had seen smoke rising from the estate grounds for several nights in a row and smelled something like burning organic material, according to local residents. Dr. Farweather's letters to Edgar Mullins led to more discoveries that made the Ashworth case even harder for him to understand. Mullins said that his family had not only his grandfather's journals, but also a collection of photos taken during surveying trips around the area in the 1890s. Journals and a lot of pictures taken during surveying trips around the area in the 1890s. These pictures showed many things that had only been written about before. Pictures of the estate grounds showed the complicated garden layouts that Cordelia had dug up later, the outbuildings that had been taken down, and several views of the basement laboratory while it was being built, when the digging work was still visible. What was even more disturbing was pictures of Silas and Cordelia doing what looked like field research with helpers whose identities were unknown, carrying equipment that looked like medical and surgical tools. One picture from 1896 showed Silas and two helpers working at what looked like an excavation site a few miles from the main estate. The three people were standing around a rectangular hole that was about 8 feet long and 4 feet wide. The size was very close to that of a human grave. The tools in the picture looked like they were made for anatomical work, rather than real scientific or archaeological research. This suggests that the excavation was more about getting specimens than doing regular field work. A picture taken inside the basement lab while Silas was still alive was even more revealing. This picture shows the collection room in its early stages, with maybe 24 specimen containers on wooden shelves. There were a few containers, clear enough to show that they contained human tissues and organs preserved in a clear medium. This provided visual proof that matched the written descriptions found in the sealed court records. Dr. Fairweather was convinced by the pictures that the Ashworth operation had been much bigger than anyone had thought before. The evidence showed that Silas had been doing systematic human experiments for years before he died, and that Cordelia had not only continued this work, but after his death, she had a lot more time to work on it. But Dr. Fairweather's investigation took an unexpected turn when he started having personal problems that seemed to be connected to his work on the case. Starting in early 1967, he told his co-workers that he was having nightmares about his work that kept coming back, and that he had developed what he called an obsessive interest in preservation techniques and anatomical research that was getting in the way of his work, with his other schoolwork. Reports from Dr. Fairweather's research assistant that he had started doing strange experiments in his university lab were even more concerning. He was working late at night on projects that involved preserving organic tissues in ways that didn't seem to have anything to do with his historical research. Dr. Farweather said that when asked about these things, he was just testing theories about preservation methods that had come up in his research on the Ashworth case. In the spring of 1968, Dr. Farweather was getting ready to present his research at a conference of Appalachian historians when he had what was officially called a fatal heart attack at his home in Charlottesville. But the circumstances of his death raised questions that were never fully answered. It looks like a fire in his home office on the same night he died destroyed the research materials he had about the Ashworth case, and a few co-workers said that his. In the weeks leading up to his death, he had been acting more strangely and keeping things to himself. Other researchers couldn't check or continue a lot of Dr. Farweather's work on the Ashworth case because he lost his research materials. He gave his academic papers to the university library, but they only had early findings and theoretical ideas, not the detailed evidence he had apparently found during his investigation. In the years after Dr. Farweather's. After Ashworth died, the property slowly changed as the economy made the mountain land more valuable for homes and businesses. Hikers who go into the remote areas can still see the original house foundations, but the basement rooms were permanently sealed off during redevelopment work in the 1970s. Most of the people who used to live in the mountain community around the estate have moved to cities in search of better job opportunities. A few old people who still live in the area sometimes talk about the widow's experiments, but these stories have become more and more distorted over time and are usually seen as folklore rather than historical fact. Researchers can still look at official county records of the Ashwood case, but they only show the basic facts about Cordelia's disappearance and the finding of the basement lab. Dr. Farweather's more detailed evidence was never used in the official story. Into the official story, and most historians who come across references to the case think it is just a sad example of mental illness and social isolation in the mountain communities after the Civil War. But the fact that the Ashworth estate used to be in a remote mountain area still makes me feel uneasy. People who hike in the area today often say they feel uneasy for no reason, as if the land itself remembers what happened there in the past. The springs that feed the streams that flow down from the estate have minerals in them that make the water taste very metallic. Wildlife patterns in the area are also strange, and local naturalists have never been able to explain them fully. People who know about the historical case sometimes wonder if Cordelia Ashworth got the immortality she wanted through her horrible experiments. Not in the way she thought, but in the way that some secrets get out, forever stuck in the places where they were born, causing problems that last long after the events that caused them have become history. The mountain is good at keeping secrets, just like mountains always have. But on some autumn mornings, when the mist still rises from the hollows of Wise County, some people say they see a figure moving through the trees near the old estate grounds. It looks like the figure is carefully carrying something in both hands, as if they are still working on it. Needs endless patience and perfect accuracy. It is impossible to say if these sightings are anything more than the power of suggestion and local legend. But the fact that people still talk about them more than 100 years after Cordelia's disappearance suggests that some stories don't end just because their main characters have died. That might be the real secret of the widow's inheritance. Not the money she made by getting married or the scientific knowledge she sought through her horrible experiments, but the knowledge that some types of work, once started, create obligations that go beyond the normal limits of death. Cordelia may have tied herself to the mountain in ways she never expected in her quest to keep consciousness alive after physical death. She is not immortal, but eternal, doomed to continue her terrible research until she finds the last specimen for a collection that can never be finished. The mist still comes up from the holes. Every morning, it brings with it the secrets of more than 100 years. And somewhere in that mist, according to people who say they saw her, a figure still walks the mountain paths, looking for something that was lost long ago in the basement lab of a house that no longer exists. She is looking for an inheritance that may have cost far more than it promised to give. The leaves fall in the fall, as they always do, covering the slopes of the mountains with the debris of another year. But some people think that something is waiting to be found by an unwary traveler who strays too far from the beaten path under those leaves, in soil that was disturbed long ago by excavations whose purpose was too terrible to acknowledge. The widow's inheritance secret may never be fully known, but for those who know the history of that faraway mountain estate, the fact that there are still questions is probably more troubling than any truth that could be proven. Some things should stay secret, and some secrets are too dangerous to tell everyone about. The mountain stands tall, as it always has, watching over the broken dreams and the results of seeking knowledge without wisdom or control. That might be the only thing that matters in the end. The idea that some lines should never be crossed, and that some doors can never be safely closed once they are opened.